There are moments in history when the world becomes obsessed with a single headline while missing the far larger transformation unfolding beneath it. Governments exchange warnings, military forces reposition across strategic regions, financial markets react within minutes, and television networks race to explain who gained the advantage and who suffered the setback. Yet history teaches us that the most important geopolitical shifts rarely happen in a single day. They emerge gradually, through a series of decisions that, taken individually, appear manageable, but collectively reshape the international order. That is why the latest tensions surrounding the Strait of Hormuz deserve far more than a discussion about military deployments or diplomatic statements. They force us to ask a much deeper question. Are we witnessing another temporary crisis in the Middle East? Or are we watching the gradual evolution of a new global balance of power? For decades, American influence has been one of the defining pillars of international security, guaranteeing freedom of navigation, protecting critical trade routes, and reassuring allies across multiple continents. But every dominant power eventually encounters moments when its assumptions collide with changing realities. The real story is not simply whether one country wins or loses a diplomatic confrontation. The real story is how power itself evolves when the economic, military, and political landscape begins to change faster than long-established strategies can adapt. To understand why the Strait of Hormuz remains at the center of so many geopolitical crises, we must first understand its extraordinary strategic importance. Although this waterway appears small on a map, it connects the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea, serving as one of the world's most significant maritime corridors. A substantial portion of globally traded oil and liquefied natural gas passes through these waters every day, making the uninterrupted flow of shipping essential not only for regional economies, but for industries, consumers, and governments across the globe. When uncertainty develops in this narrow passage, the effects extend far beyond the Middle East. Energy traders adjust prices almost immediately. Insurers recalculate maritime risks. Investors reconsider market exposure, and governments quietly prepare contingency plans. Modern globalization has created a world where events occurring within a relatively small geographical space can influence inflation, industrial production, transportation costs, and economic confidence thousands of miles away. This interconnectedness explains why every development in the Strait of Hormuz receives such extraordinary international attention. For many observers, discussions about maritime security focus primarily on naval strength, missile capabilities, and military alliances. While these factors certainly matter, they represent only part of the equation. Modern geopolitical competition is equally driven by economics, diplomacy, technological innovation, legal interpretation, and strategic communication. Military power can deter aggression, but it cannot by itself guarantee political success. Likewise, economic leverage may create opportunities for negotiation, yet it cannot entirely eliminate security concerns. Governments therefore operate in an environment where every decision carries multiple consequences. A military deployment intended to reassure allies may be interpreted elsewhere as an escalation. Economic sanctions designed to influence political behavior may encourage alternative trading partnerships. Diplomatic pressure intended to isolate one country may instead accelerate new regional relationships. Every action creates reactions, often in ways policymakers never originally anticipated. The relationship between the United States and Iran illustrates this complexity better than almost any other international rivalry. Decades of mutual distrust, political disagreement, economic sanctions, and regional competition have produced a strategic environment in which even limited incidents can quickly become global concerns. Yet despite this long history of confrontation, both countries also understand the extraordinary costs associated with uncontrolled escalation. Neither side benefits from prolonged regional instability that threatens international commerce, disrupts energy markets, or increases uncertainty throughout the global economy. This paradox creates one of the defining characteristics of modern geopolitics. Governments simultaneously prepare for worst-case scenarios while searching for diplomatic mechanisms capable of preventing those scenarios from becoming reality. The result is an uneasy balance between deterrence and dialogue, competition and cooperation, confrontation and restraint. International law adds another important dimension to this picture. Maritime navigation, territorial waters, exclusive economic zones, sanctions, and treaty obligations all influence how governments justify their policies before the international community. Yet legal interpretation rarely produces unanimous agreement. Countries often emphasize different legal principles depending on their strategic interests, and international organizations frequently become arenas where competing narratives are presented rather than immediately resolved. Understanding this reality is essential, because geopolitical disagreements today are fought not only through military capabilities, but also through competing legal arguments, diplomatic messaging, and efforts to shape international opinion. The struggle for legitimacy has become almost as significant as the struggle for strategic advantage. History provides valuable lessons for understanding these dynamics. Throughout the rise and decline of great powers, overconfidence has repeatedly emerged as one of the most dangerous strategic vulnerabilities. Civilizations that achieved extraordinary military, economic, or political success sometimes began assuming that their previous victories guaranteed future success, regardless of changing circumstances. Historians have documented numerous examples where dominant powers underestimated emerging challenges, ignored logistical realities, or dismissed warnings because earlier achievements created excessive confidence. These historical examples do not suggest that decline is inevitable for every great power, but they do remind us that adaptability often proves more important than raw strength. Successful states recognize changing realities early enough to adjust strategy before circumstances force far more difficult choices. Economic resilience has become increasingly important in this context. The 21st century differs dramatically from earlier eras because globalization has interconnected national economies in unprecedented ways. Supply chains span multiple continents, financial markets respond instantaneously to geopolitical developments, and technological innovation influences strategic competition as much as conventional military capabilities. Governments therefore seek not only military superiority, but also diversified energy supplies, resilient infrastructure, secure technological industries, and stable international partnerships. National security can no longer be measured solely by the number of aircraft carriers or missile systems. It increasingly depends upon economic flexibility, technological leadership, diplomatic credibility, and the ability to maintain public confidence during periods of uncertainty. Another significant transformation involves the broader international system itself. Following the end of the Cold War, many analysts described a world characterized primarily by overwhelming American influence. Over time, however, additional centers of economic and political power have emerged. China has expanded its global commercial presence. India has increased its strategic importance. Regional organizations have become more active, and middle powers now play increasingly influential diplomatic roles. This does not necessarily mean that one era has completely ended and another has fully replaced it. Instead, it suggests that international politics is becoming more distributed, requiring greater coordination among a wider range of actors. Managing complex regional crises, therefore, depends not only on bilateral relationships, but also on broader networks of cooperation involving neighboring states, international institutions, and economic partners. One lesson repeatedly demonstrated throughout history is that geopolitical influence depends as much upon credibility as capability. Military resources remain essential, but alliances require trust, diplomatic initiatives require consistency, and long-term partnerships require predictability. Governments evaluate not only whether a country possesses significant power, but also how that power is exercised. Strategic leadership, therefore, involves balancing firmness with restraint, deterrence with diplomacy, and national interest with broader international stability. These considerations often determine whether regional partners choose closer cooperation, greater neutrality, or independent approaches to shared challenges. Looking ahead, the Strait of Hormuz will almost certainly remain one of the world's most closely watched strategic regions. Energy security, maritime commerce, technological competition, regional diplomacy, and great power rivalry all converge within this narrow corridor. Every development will continue attracting worldwide attention because the consequences extend far beyond local geography. Yet the most important questions concern not only immediate events, but also the larger trajectory of international politics. Can governments successfully manage strategic competition without allowing miscalculation to trigger broader confrontation? Can diplomacy keep pace with rapidly changing security environments? Can economic interdependence continue acting as a stabilizing force despite growing geopolitical rivalry? These questions will shape not only the future of the Middle East, but also the evolution of the international system itself. Ultimately, history reminds us that the durability of global order depends upon the willingness of nations to adapt, communicate, and recognize the limits of coercion alone. Military strength remains an important element of national security, but sustainable influence requires something more enduring: credibility, resilience, effective diplomacy, and the ability to build partnerships capable of weathering periods of uncertainty. As the world continues navigating an increasingly complex geopolitical landscape, the Strait of Hormuz serves as a powerful reminder that narrow waterways can influence global destinies, that regional crises can reshape international relationships, and that the future of world politics will be determined not by headlines alone, but by the strategic decisions governments make long after those headlines disappear. The most revealing aspect of every geopolitical crisis is not the first reaction, but the second. Initial responses are often driven by urgency, emotion, and the pressure to demonstrate resolve. The decisions that follow, however, expose something much deeper. They reveal how governments actually perceive their strategic position and how much room they believe they have to maneuver. Every public statement, every diplomatic visit, every military deployment, and every economic announcement becomes part of a larger conversation between states. Sometimes those messages are directed at rivals. Sometimes they are intended for allies. Just as often, they are meant for domestic audiences whose confidence leaders must maintain during uncertain times. This is why understanding international politics requires looking beyond dramatic headlines and examining the quieter signals that often receive far less attention. These quieter developments frequently reveal where governments believe the future is heading long before official policy documents acknowledge it. One of the defining characteristics of the 21st century is that economic influence has become inseparable from national security. Previous generations often viewed trade as something separate from military affairs, but today's interconnected world no longer allows such distinctions. A disruption in energy transportation affects manufacturing, financial markets, food production, shipping, aviation, and inflation simultaneously. Every major economy depends upon uninterrupted commercial activity, making strategic waterways not merely transportation routes, but pillars of global stability. This explains why governments that may disagree on numerous political issues still share a common interest in preserving the free flow of international commerce. Even fierce geopolitical competitors recognize that severe disruptions carry costs that extend far beyond any immediate tactical advantage. The challenge lies in balancing legitimate national security concerns with the collective interest of maintaining economic stability for the international system as a whole. Technology has transformed this balance even further. Information now travels around the globe in seconds, creating an environment where public perception evolves almost as quickly as military operations themselves. Satellite imagery, commercial shipping trackers, financial indicators, and social media updates provide unprecedented visibility into global events. Yet greater access to information has not necessarily produced greater clarity. On the contrary, governments, analysts, journalists, and citizens must now distinguish between verified facts, competing interpretations, incomplete reports, and deliberate misinformation. This information environment has become an additional arena of strategic competition. Winning the narrative can influence diplomatic support, investor confidence, and international legitimacy almost as much as developments occurring on the ground. Every crisis, therefore, unfolds simultaneously in two domains: the physical world of military and economic activity, and the informational world, where competing explanations seek to shape global understanding. Meanwhile, regional governments continue adapting to an increasingly multipolar international environment. Rather than depending exclusively on one major power for security or economic development, many states now pursue broader diplomatic strategies designed to maximize flexibility. Partnerships are diversified across multiple regions, allowing countries to reduce dependence while increasing opportunities for investment, technology transfer, and commercial cooperation. This evolution reflects a broader recognition that the international system has become more interconnected and less predictable than during previous decades. Strategic autonomy has therefore become a priority for many governments, enabling them to maintain productive relationships with different global actors, even when those actors compete with one another. Energy itself is also undergoing significant transformation. Although oil and natural gas remain indispensable components of the global economy, investments in renewable energy, advanced battery technology, hydrogen production, and alternative transportation systems are gradually changing long-term strategic calculations. These transitions will take years, perhaps decades, to fully materialize. But governments are already planning for a future in which energy diversification becomes an increasingly important component of national resilience. The countries that successfully balance traditional energy security with technological innovation may find themselves better prepared for future geopolitical shocks than those relying exclusively upon established models. Consequently, today's debates about maritime security are connected not only to current energy markets, but also to broader questions about the future structure of the global economy. At the same time, military planners increasingly recognize that modern deterrence depends upon far more than numerical superiority. Logistics, industrial capacity, cyber resilience, intelligence integration, supply chain security, and technological adaptability all contribute to long-term strategic effectiveness. Recent conflicts have demonstrated that sustained operations require enormous economic resources, reliable manufacturing capabilities, and resilient transportation networks. Nations capable of maintaining these supporting systems often enjoy advantages that exceed those provided by individual weapons platforms alone. This reality has encouraged governments around the world to strengthen domestic industries, diversify suppliers, and invest in critical technologies viewed as essential for long-term national security. Diplomacy remains the indispensable counterpart to these preparations. Contrary to popular perception, diplomatic engagement does not represent weakness or concession. Instead, it reflects recognition that military power alone rarely resolves complex geopolitical disputes. Successful diplomacy creates channels through which misunderstandings can be clarified, tensions managed, and crises contained before they escalate beyond anyone's original intentions. Even during periods of profound disagreement, governments frequently maintain communication because the absence of dialogue increases the probability of dangerous miscalculation. Throughout history, some of the most consequential negotiations have occurred not during times of peace, but during periods of intense rivalry, when both sides recognize the catastrophic consequences of uncontrolled escalation. Another important consideration is the psychology of strategic competition. Great powers often evaluate not only objective capabilities, but also perceptions of credibility and resolve. Leaders understand that every major decision sends signals extending far beyond the immediate issue under discussion. Allies assess reliability, competitors evaluate determination, financial markets measure stability, and domestic audiences interpret leadership through the lens of national confidence. This creates a difficult balancing act. Excessive caution may invite questions regarding commitment, while excessive escalation risks unintended consequences that outweigh any immediate strategic benefit. Navigating between these extremes requires careful judgment informed by history, intelligence, diplomacy, and realistic assessments of national interests. Ultimately, the future of international stability will depend upon whether major powers successfully adapt to an increasingly interconnected and competitive world. The challenges confronting today's leaders differ substantially from those faced during previous generations. Economic globalization, technological acceleration, climate pressures, demographic change, and shifting geopolitical alignments have created a strategic environment of extraordinary complexity. No single nation, regardless of its capabilities, can independently shape every outcome. Cooperation remains necessary in some areas, even while competition continues in others. This dual reality defines the emerging international landscape, where rivalry and interdependence coexist in ways that often appear contradictory, but increasingly represent the normal condition of global affairs. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is that power itself is never static. History consistently demonstrates that influence depends upon a nation's ability to evolve alongside changing circumstances, rather than relying exclusively upon past achievements. Military strength, economic innovation, diplomatic credibility, institutional resilience, and societal adaptability all contribute to long-term strategic success. Countries that recognize these evolving realities early often manage periods of transition more effectively than those attempting to preserve outdated assumptions. The Strait of Hormuz, therefore, should be understood not merely as a location where geopolitical tensions periodically emerge, but as a symbol of the broader transformation reshaping international politics. What happens there reflects deeper changes occurring throughout the global system, changes that will continue influencing diplomacy, economics, security, and international cooperation for years to come. The coming decade may not be defined by a single decisive confrontation, but by the gradual evolution of a world learning to navigate new balances of power, new partnerships, and new strategic realities that will shape the international order for generations. As global attention remains fixed on strategic flashpoints, another transformation is quietly unfolding beneath the surface, one that receives far less media attention than aircraft carriers, missile systems, or emergency diplomatic meetings. The real competition of the 21st century is increasingly about endurance rather than domination. During the Cold War, military power was often measured by how quickly one nation could overwhelm another. Today, success is measured by something far more complicated. Which country can sustain economic pressure the longest, preserve political unity during periods of uncertainty, maintain technological superiority while protecting critical industries, and adapt faster than its competitors? Modern geopolitical rivalry has become a contest of resilience. It is no longer enough to possess impressive military capabilities if the economy struggles to support prolonged strategic competition, or if domestic political divisions weaken national decision-making. This shift has fundamentally changed how governments calculate risk, forcing policymakers to think not only in terms of battles or diplomatic victories, but in terms of years, even decades, of sustained strategic competition. Perhaps nowhere is this transformation more visible than in the changing relationship between military strength and economic influence. Every major conflict over the past generation has demonstrated that industrial capacity matters just as much as battlefield performance. Advanced weapons require sophisticated manufacturing, rare earth minerals, semiconductor technologies, complex international supply chains, and highly skilled workforces. Nations capable of protecting these foundations gain strategic advantages that cannot be measured simply by counting ships or aircraft. This reality has encouraged governments across the world to rethink globalization itself. Rather than pursuing efficiency alone, countries increasingly prioritize resilience, redundancy, and domestic production of critical technologies. Semiconductor fabrication, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, cybersecurity, satellite communications, and advanced energy infrastructure are no longer viewed merely as commercial industries. They have become pillars of national security, shaping geopolitical influence in ways that rival traditional military capabilities. Meanwhile, another trend continues reshaping international politics: the rise of middle powers. For much of the 20th century, discussions about global affairs focused primarily on superpowers. Today, however, countries that were once considered secondary actors increasingly play decisive diplomatic roles. Nations with stable economies, strategic geography, or influential regional relationships now possess greater leverage than ever before. Rather than choosing sides in great power competition, many pursue balanced foreign policies designed to maximize flexibility while avoiding unnecessary confrontation. This approach reflects an increasingly multipolar international environment in which influence is distributed more widely than at any point in recent decades. As a result, diplomacy has become significantly more complicated. Building international consensus now requires accommodating a broader range of perspectives, interests, and regional priorities than previous generations of policymakers often confronted. This changing landscape also challenges long-standing assumptions about alliances. Traditional security partnerships remain enormously important, yet even the strongest alliances evolve as circumstances change. Governments continuously reassess their national interests in light of shifting economic conditions, domestic political developments, technological innovation, and regional security concerns. Allies do not always agree on tactics, even when they share similar long-term objectives.